Are you stuck trying to choose between the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ 100? One is more broadly diversified across the US economy, and the other is more tech specific. It's very tech heavy. Today, I'm going to discuss with you the differences between these two indexes, where you can buy their respective ETFs on the Australian Stock Exchange, as well as some of the pros and cons of each and which one I would personally choose at the end of the day. So what do these indexes actually track? Well, the S&P 500 is your 500 largest companies listed on the S&P index. They make up a variety of different sectors. So think of companies like Apple, ExxonMobil, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Coca-Cola, and so on. Now the NASDAQ 100 are companies that are only listed on the NASDAQ stock exchange. And these are your 100 largest companies. So think of companies like Apple again, Microsoft, Nvidia, Tesla, and even companies like Lululemon and Pepsi. Now you have to note that there are no industrials or very few industrials, energy, and financials. So most of the index is made up of tech. Now, over the last decade, the NASDAQ 100 has outperformed the S&P 500, sometimes by a lot. Now, we have to keep in mind that the NASDAQ 100 does have outperformance. However, it can come with some more risk and is a little bit more volatile when compared to the S&P 500. So you're going to see typically more highs and lows when investing in the NASDAQ 100 versus compared to the S&P 500. For example, in 2022, the NASDAQ 100 fell over 30%, while the S&P 500 fell around 25% or so. Here's another key difference: diversification. Now, the S&P 500 is made up of a variety of sectors. I believe about 11 different sectors. So you can think tech, consumer staples, energy, financials, and so on. Now, the NASDAQ 100 is also a variety of different sectors. However, it is sector specific in regards to tech. Tech makes up about 50% of the NASDAQ 100's weight, which thus, in theory, would make it more sector concentrated and therefore results in the increase in volatility. So here's the million-dollar question. If you want more broad, long-term, stable growth with more diversification, you can go with the S&P 500. It has a long historical track record of great performance. Now, if you're a little bit younger and you can stomach a little bit more volatility over time, you can also look to the NASDAQ 100. Now, the NASDAQ 100, like I said, has more highs and lows. However, over the past 10 years and even longer, the NASDAQ has tended to outperform the S&P 500. So you may see some better returns in the NASDAQ 100 moving forward. When looking for a personal pick for exposure to the S&P 500, here in Australia, I would go with IVV, which is the iShares S&P 500 index listed on the ASX index. It has over $10 billion in assets under management with very small management fee of about 0.04%. And it has a historical track record of returns of over 15% annualized over the last 5 years, thus providing a simple and relatively cost-effective way for the average Australian to invest in the US stock market. When looking to get exposure to the NASDAQ 100 here in Australia, I would go with the NDQ, or NASDAQ 100 index with beta shares. This is listed also on the ASX index. It has over $4 billion in assets under management, with a slightly larger management fee of 0.48%. It returns around 18% annualized over the last 5 years. At the end of the day, both of these indexes and ETFs are phenomenal long-term investments. And for the average Australian, they're both very accessible through their respective ETFs listed on the ASX Stock Exchange, IVV for the S&P 500, and NDQ for the NASDAQ 100. You don't have to pick one or the other. You can pick both or you can pick neither. But you do need to understand your own goals and your risk tolerance if you are going to be adding these positions into your portfolio. So if you did have to pick one, which one would you choose? Would you go with the S&P 500 for its diversification, or potentially the NASDAQ 100 for its tech exposure and growth? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please subscribe and leave a like.